JonathanKing20. And I'm sorry to go on so long, I was still only about 20 myself. It was the 60s and it was an incredible time, and Britain was really ruling the world. And people have asked me why. Was it the Mersey sound coming out of Liverpool? Was it people like Brian Epstein? Was it the great producers like Joe Meek? And I have to tell you, it was not for me the Beatles or the Stones or any of that. It was one key ingredient: pirate radio. Pirate radio made our lives when we were teenagers, when I was 15, 16, 17, changed our lives. It was exciting, it played great music, it was sort of illegal but they couldn't do anything about it, so it was brave, it was different. Parents hated it, adults hated it, and we loved it. Radio London, Radio Caroline, pirate radio from ships all around the coasts of Britain. That's what made Britain great in the 60s. For me, the one thing, and it was absolutely vital. Anyway, we reached 1967 and they closed the pirate radio stations down. It had taken them 3 or 4 years. Finally, they came up with the legislation to squash it. That was old Labour. New Labour ain't much better, I can tell you. Anyway, Radio 1 was set up by the BBC instead of the Light programme, and it had various controllers, all of whom became good friends of mine. Robin Scott was the first, and his secretary, Shirley Jones, is still my secretary and friend in America these days. Derek Chinnery was another good friend, and Johnny Beerling, who was perhaps the best and the most adventurous of all the controllers, and was a friend of mine when he was a mere producer, and remains a very dear friend even now to this day in 2006. Hi Johnny. The DJs were all interesting and fun. Most of them had come from pirate radio. John Peel, who I loved, and John and I got on like a house on fire. There's one rather amusing scene from later on when John and I were both at the Reading Festival, and we'd been out watching Courtney Love performing with her band Hole. And her husband, Kurt Cobain, had died only a few weeks earlier. And she was completely out of her mind. And I thought it was incredibly embarrassing because she was almost falling off the stage. She was not hitting a note. And I said to John, I've got to tell you, this is the worst performance I have ever seen. And John said, I think it's the greatest performance I've ever seen. She's just had this incredible tragedy. She's so brave going on there. I think she's fantastic, which shows a slight difference between John and me. Anyway, John and I went backstage. We were sitting on the ground. There wasn't anywhere to sit backstage when the set finished and Courtney came out and sat on the top step of the stairs leading down with her head in her hands and her legs akimbo. And I looked at John and John looked at me. And Courtney was clearly not wearing any underwear. And I said to John, John, I think we've just seen Courtney's hole. Peely and I were very good friends, and in fact he was the one who advised me to take on a brilliant guy as an executive to run my UK records a few years later, which was Clive Selwood, who had run Dandelion Records for John. And right up to the end of his life I had huge admiration for John and a great deal of affection for him. Kenny Everett, who I've spoken about earlier, was also on Radio 1. Fluff Freeman, Alan Freeman, one of the great DJs of all time. Tony Blackburn, loved music. A lot of terrific DJs and people. And television was good at the time as well. It was not only Top of the Pops, there was Ready Steady Go, there was Thank You Lucky Stars. The warm-up man on Ready Steady Go was a guy called Paul Gadd, who went on to become Gary Glitter about 5 years later. Rod Stewart was always trying to get on the show but never could because he didn't have any hits or any success. Reg Dwight would be there trying to do something. He became Elton John. Mark Bolan, who of course then was T-Rex. All of the people in the 60s who never quite made it but were around and mixing with us, going to all the clubs and seeing us all the time, didn't make it in the 60s. But when the generation that did happen in the 60s gave up or got onto drugs or were married and had children and had other things to do and everything else, then slowly a gap appeared, and instead of new young people coming in, all the people who were sort of a bit, I have to say, second division in the 60s came through in the 70s and became big stars. There were also a lot of other musicians there, Long John Baldry, who had his big hit, I think, in 67 or so. Alexis Corner, who was one of the godfathers of the blues movement and found an awful lot of future stars. And I remember in 1965, one of my favourite records was I Got You Babe by Sonny and Cher. And funnily enough, Sonny and Cher came to London and they knocked me off the #1 slot. I showed you the Radio London chart earlier on. I think that was Jonathan King 2, 18 episodes ago. And Sonny and Cher were the ones that knocked me off the top slot when they arrived, but it didn't matter to me. I spent hours talking to Sonny about Phil Spector, who I worshipped as a producer, and Sonny had worked with and knew everything about. I spent hours talking to Cher, who was a delight and a very sweet lady, and has turned into not only, I think, perhaps the best rock female vocalist of all time, but also a magnificent actress and remains a lovely lady. And we got very friendly. I remember Cher's daughter was around at the time. Not daughter, I mean sister was around at the time as well. It was a marvellous, marvellous era, and so therefore I need not apologise for going on about the 60s at some length.